Russia claims it has captured the Luhansk region in Ukraine's east. It is also stepping up attacks against civilian centers like residential buildings and shopping malls. Ukraine's civilian casualties and troop losses are mounting as well. Is Ukraine losing this war?
Not at all.
That's from my guest this week, joining me from Lugano in Switzerland. Kurt Volker is a former US ambassador to NATO and a former US special representative for Ukraine negotiations. And he believes the West should be doing more to support Ukraine.
Remember, the Ukrainians are paying for our security with their lives. We would be paying for their security with higher prices.
But could cracks in the Western alliance derail long-term support for Ukraine? All this and more on Conflict Zone. Ambassador Kurt Volker, welcome to Conflict Zone.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
NATO held a summit last week in which it declared its strategic concept, and Russia was labeled a direct threat to the bloc. How does that help Ukraine?
Well, I think first off, it's important that NATO actually do its first job, which is collective defense. And so by recognizing the threat that Russia presents in Europe as a whole, not only against Ukraine, but against NATO allies as well, NATO is taking an important step. And this gives NATO a foundation for improving its own defense capabilities, increasing defense spending, increasing high readiness forces, deploying forces further forward. All of this is meant to contain Russia. It doesn't do anything for Ukraine specifically, but some of the other NATO allies, of course, including the United States and Germany and the UK, are providing direct assistance to Ukraine, but that's done outside the NATO framework.
Now, you've said in a recent interview that when it comes to protecting the bloc, NATO has done a very good job. You just said the same thing right now. But when it comes to being relevant and effective in crisis management during the biggest war in Europe, quote, NATO hasn't distinguished itself. Is NATO failing Ukraine, Ambassador Volker?
Well, I think NATO is not playing a role right now in this largest war in Europe. NATO was founded in order to create security for the allies, and it is doing that. But its second core function from the strategic concept, even the one that was just agreed at the Madrid summit, it says the second core function of NATO is crisis management. And NATO is not really involved in ending this crisis, Russia's war against Ukraine. One thing that I think NATO could be doing even today is providing a clearinghouse function for arms shipments to Ukraine. The United States is doing this out of Ramstein Air Base, doing it on a bilateral basis with many other countries. But this is something that NATO has done before and could do in this case as well.
What else should NATO be doing? Is it just about a clearinghouse function, or is there more that NATO could be doing to directly help Ukraine?
Yeah, I think there are also functions in terms of intelligence collection and sharing with Ukrainians. There are communications functions that could be done. And most importantly, I think it's the training and equipping of the Ukrainian forces. NATO could do that, but it's being done only by individual allies at this time.
So just going back to that summit in Madrid, NATO has committed more troops to the east. It has committed more troops to the Baltics. It has increased its response force by a factor of 8 to about 300,000. NATO is still not on the right track.
Well, no, I think NATO is on the right track in terms of collective defense. As I said, I think there it has done a very good job. The increases in high readiness forces, if they are truly realized, will be very significant. The forward deployment of forces to Poland, Romania, the Baltic states, that's very important. And the inclusion of Finland and Sweden will do a lot to strengthen security in Northern Europe. So all of those things are very positive. It is again coming to this question of Ukraine and the ongoing war in Europe, where tens of thousands of people have been killed and millions have been displaced. This is where we need all of us, whether it's individual allies or NATO or frankly the European Union or others. We need to step up our support for Ukraine so that Ukraine can win this war quickly.
Let's talk about winning this war quickly. Ukrainian President Zelensky has been asking for long-range artillery pieces for months. He's also asked for $5 billion per month to keep the war going against Russia. Is he finally going to get this?
He's getting some of what he's asking for, but not all of it. The U.S. HIMARS missile launcher systems have arrived in Ukraine and are beginning to be integrated into the forces. And that has already helped the Ukrainians take out some Russian ammunition depots, for instance, at Melitopol airport. So that is important. They're also going to be getting some more sophisticated air defense systems, which should help protect cities against some of
But
these
I think
missiles.
the point that President Zelensky is making, that he's not getting them fast enough when he needs them. Is that going to start to happen now?
Unfortunately, I don't see any change in that. I agree with President Zelensky. He's not getting as much as he needs. He needs hundreds of thousands of more rounds of ammunition. He needs dozens more multiple launch rocket systems, artillery systems, and he's getting smaller numbers, and he's getting them at a slower pace than I think all of us would like to see.
Why is that happening? Is that because NATO is dragging its feet, or because these stocks just don't exist to be able to provide them to Ukraine when Ukraine wants them?
Well, again, this is not something that NATO is doing at all. It is something that individual NATO countries are doing, particularly the United States. Germany, I know, has very low stocks. Other NATO countries also have very low stocks. The U.S. has been drawing down its stocks of defense materials and providing it to Ukraine, but it is nonetheless taking a long time. This question, for example, about providing these multiple launch rocket systems, the longer range artillery, we knew back in February and March that this would be needed, and it is now July and they're just arriving. So this is something where we could have acted much faster.
What is the risk if these weapons aren't delivered to Ukraine when they want them?
Well, the risk is that more Ukrainians die. The Russians are using artillery to pound Ukrainian positions. They have longer range artillery, so when they fire, Ukrainians don't have the range to fire back. They have thousands and thousands and thousands more rounds of ammunition than the Ukrainians have, so the ratio is almost tenfold what the Russians are delivering. Now, the Russian stocks are inaccurate. Some of them don't work. Estimates can be anywhere from a half to two-thirds don't work when they land. But even then, this is very dangerous for the Ukrainians. If they get the systems there, they can push the Russians back.
I'd like to talk more about that and how the war is going. Now, the UN has so far recorded some more than 10,000 civilian casualties in Ukraine. Some 12 million people have been forced to flee their home. And now, over the weekend, Russia is claiming that it controls the Luhansk region. Is Ukraine losing this war?
Not at all. Russia entered this war in order to rebuild the Russian Empire, to exterminate Ukraine as a country and as a civilization, as a people. And it has utterly failed to do that. The Ukrainians have pushed them back from Kyiv, from the north, from Kharkiv, from Sumy, from Chernihiv, from Odessa. So the Ukrainians have established that they will remain a sovereign, independent European democracy. This is critically important. Russia has taken about 20% of Ukrainian territory. That has come at a tremendously high price for Russia. They're going probably now not to be able to take much more and try to dig in and defend instead.
But I think the question, Ambassador Volker, is what happens about this 20%? I mean, you're quite right. Avril D. Haines, the director of U.S. National Intelligence, did say Russia controls about 20% of Ukraine. But then you have President Zelensky remaining firm on the assertion that Ukraine will regain all of its sovereignty by retaking all of this territory. Is this even realistic?
It is realistic. It's ambitious, but it is realistic. The Ukrainians now, having basically let the Russians exhaust themselves militarily, and Russia not gaining more ground, will now be in a position where they are just sitting there. Ukraine will begin counteroffensives to retake territory. They will be more strategic than the Russians were. What the Russians just took in Luhansk is not very militarily significant. The Ukrainians will be first trying to get the Russians out of Kherson, cutting off their supply lines there and pushing them back, breaking the land bridge between Donbas and Crimea, probably around Melitopol, and trying to push the Russians further away from Kharkiv. All of this, I think, is quite achievable. How far the Ukrainians can push back, we don't know yet, but we know they have the determination to fight.
Is this what victory looks like for Ukraine, given the situation on the ground now?
Well, victory for Ukraine is its survival as a sovereign, independent European democracy, and that's already assured. Now the question is, can they get all of their territory back or not? I certainly hope they can, but that will be part of the fighting that we see coming up later this summer and in the autumn.
A lot of this will depend on how the negotiations finally end up. I mean, they're supposed to begin at some point. They will have to begin at some point. And just on that point, I'd like to draw your attention to a recent joint article in The Telegraph that Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba authored with his UK counterpart Liz Truss. They wrote, and I quote, "Putin will only be serious about negotiations once the Ukrainian people have pushed his troops back." And I think we both agree that that won't be quick or easy. Is there a risk that Ukraine's Western backers won't have the patience for that?
There is a risk. You know, you do hear periodically statements about, well, we must not humiliate Putin. I think it was President Macron who said that, or that Ukraine needs to negotiate, the costs are too high. But every time that happens, the Ukrainians insist that it's their country and they will be the ones to decide whether they are fighting back to retake it or not, and they have every intention to do so. And as long as the Ukrainians maintain that resolve, I am pretty sure that the West and the United States will continue to support Ukraine.
I mean, you talked about what President Macron had said, for which he was quite heavily criticized by the Ukrainian. But then you also have Italy, which circulated in May a peace plan, which essentially put the Donbass and Crimea up for negotiation between Russia and Ukraine. Do you think there is a real risk here that richer nations in Europe, like Germany, France, Italy, will push for a ceasefire, even if that comes at the cost of Ukrainian territory?
Yes, I think that is a risk. You saw that with the Draghi plan. You saw that with Macron's comments. We've heard some comments from Germany as well. And especially as Putin will try to squeeze gas supplies to Europe this winter, he hopes that by creating more pain for West Europeans, it will cause governments in Western Europe to push Ukraine to give up territory. I think it's despicable that that is Putin's plan, but that is what he will try to do. And it is important that all of us keep up the support for Ukraine and keep the pressure back on Russia and not give in to those calls for Ukraine to give up territory.
What happens down the line, Ambassador Volker, if during negotiations Ukraine demands things that its Western backers aren't ready to support?
Well, it's hard to know what that would be, because at this point, I think the Western countries that are supporting Ukraine continuously reaffirm that we support Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and Ukraine has a right to fight back and retake territory. So there's nothing that Ukraine is asking for or saying that they have not received support for as a matter of principle from the West.
That is for the time being. Let's talk about the West as a whole. And I think by virtue of you having been a U.S. ambassador to NATO, we do need to discuss the U.S.'s role here moving forward. Now, so far in the United States, it appears that the public is heavily behind whatever actions the government is taking in support of Ukraine. But given the domestic issues, some very divisive domestic issues that are playing out in the United States now, how long can this public support stay the course?
Well, talking about the United States, I think that it will not only stay the course, but it'll increase. The Biden administration has been slow and doing partial steps and getting a lot of pressure from the Congress, Republicans and Democrats, to do more and do it faster. And that is based on strong public support for Ukraine. So I see midterm elections actually strengthening the position in Congress to push the administration to be doing even more to help Ukraine.
Just about those midterm elections, they're going to be happening in November, and it's widely predicted that the Republicans will end up controlling the House and the Senate. You are certain that U.S. bipartisanship will remain beyond November?
Yes, I think so. We've seen it already, where you have a Republican Senator Joni Ernst, you have a Republican senator on the Foreign Affairs Committee, Senator Johnson, you have others, and they are working very closely with their Democratic counterparts, the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Menendez, the Europe Committee subcommittee chair, Senator Shaheen. They're all working together. They are pushing for more support for Ukraine. And you have, even if it flips and you now have Republicans in the majority and Democrats in the minority, I think they would continue to work together to provide that support for Ukraine.
You're giving names of Republicans. Let me also throw some Republican names at you. Senate hopeful J.D. Vance, for instance, is saying, I quote, "I got to be honest with you, I don't really care what happens to Ukraine one way or the other." You have Senator Rand Paul, who is saying that the U.S. shouldn't be Ukraine's, quote, sugar daddy. I mean, these are the voices that you're hearing on the Republican side of things. Could these voices not affect the mood in the Republican Party going forward, especially after November?
Well, they are not the leading voices right now, and I don't believe they will be after November either. I mean, Rand Paul has been in the Senate for years, and he has usually expressed opinions like that and usually been quite alone. There are, in addition to the two that you mentioned, if J.D. Vance is elected, that'll add a voice. There's one or two others who are often skeptical about continued U.S. support or the scale of U.S. support. But you have Senator Mitch McConnell, who's the minority leader. If he becomes the majority leader again, he has offered very strong support for Ukraine. And the vast majority of the Republican senators, and I can name dozens of them, are very strongly supportive of Ukraine. In fact, very critical of the administration for not doing more.
I mean, you talk about what's going to happen in November, but already in May, we saw some opposition within the Republican Party, especially when it came to passing the $40 billion package of assistance for Ukraine. You had 11 Republicans in the Senate, 57 in the House who voted against it. You are certain that this does not reflect cracks in the Republican Party over support for Ukraine?
No, there are fringes on the right and there are fringes on the left. Who do not want to see the U.S. supporting Ukraine for whatever reasons, whether it's budgetary or fear of Russia or whatever it might be. But you also have, take that number 11, that's 11 Republicans. You have a handful of Democrats as well. Let's push it up to 20. That means there are still 80 senators, Republican and Democrat, prepared to vote for just about anything to support Russia or to impose sanctions on Russia. Support Ukraine or put sanctions on Russia. So that strong bipartisan support from the heart of both parties will remain.
There is opposition within the Democratic Party as well. It's not just the Republicans. I mean, Representative Ro Khanna, for example, he has said prolonged, never-ending conflict is wreaking havoc on the American economy and the global economy, and people don't want to see a resigned attitude that this is just going to go on as long as it's going to go on. Surely President Biden can't ignore this moving forward?
Well, that's what I just said, is that even if you take the fringes on both sides and put them together, you're still not going to get more than 20 votes in the Senate. So that is a very solid majority to work with. And there are strong voices on the Democratic side, including Senator Menendez, the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Chuck Schumer, who's currently the majority leader, the head of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Gregory Meeks, all very supportive of the administration, President Biden, and very supportive of the positions that the administration has taken to provide aid to Ukraine.
Ambassador Volker, you served under Donald Trump. I suppose the worry here in Europe is if his isolationist brand of U.S. foreign policy could make a return to the White House in 2024. Is that a real concern?
Yes, people should be concerned about that. We've had, and I would take it beyond President Trump, we've had every U.S. president after their election talks in one way or another about pulling back from our commitments abroad and focusing on nation building at home, as President Obama said, or it's the economy stupid, as President Clinton said, or not fighting other people's civil wars and ending two wars, as President Obama said. So this America First policy of President Trump, is part of that tradition. It's a little bit more, outspoken in the way President Trump does it, but it is a tradition that's there that we do have to watch out for. Fortunately, I think Russia's aggression that we saw since February has strengthened the internationalist side of both the Republican and Democratic parties. And it has caused them to recognize Russia's threat and the need to push back against it.
Right. Let's look at the other side of Western unity, what's happening here in the European Union. Sweden's Foreign Minister Anna Linde has warned that interest in the Ukraine war is fading because food prices, energy prices are rising. They're expected to rise even further heading later into the year. Boris Johnson is warning of Ukraine fatigue. Can Europe sustain support for the long term for Ukraine?
Yeah, that's the challenge, I think. And here, as we talked about already, I think that it will get harder for Europe as Russia squeezes energy this winter, both in terms of price and availability. It's going to cause some real hardship in Europe. And that, in turn, may put pressure on governments to say, hey, it's time for Ukraine to negotiate a ceasefire. I think that is the greater risk that we face right now.
Essentially, what you're saying is Russian gas could derail European unity.
It has done so in the past, and it could do so again. It is certainly Vladimir Putin's intention to use energy that way.
So when NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg says Ukraine will have support from the bloc, quote, for as long as it takes, do you believe him?
Well, I do. I think he's making the right statements. I think it is the intention of every country now. But just as you're identifying some of these trends that are at work, you can imagine it could change. And that's what we all have to work against, to make sure that both in the United States and especially in Europe, especially in the winter, if there's an energy crunch, that we have the fortitude to support Ukraine. Remember that Ukrainians are paying for our security with their lives. We would be paying for their security with higher prices.
You also said in March, Ambassador, that the key to Ukraine's survival is holding off Russian forces long enough for sanctions against Russia to have their impact. Do you think sanctions have gone far enough?
No, I don't. I think that they need more time. And that is something where, week by week, we see some evidence that, sanctions are taking a bite. For instance, shareholders of Gazprom just voted to increase the amount of taxes that they're paying to the Russian government. That's an indicator that the Russian government is short on cash. So there are things that we're starting to see. But I think we need to close loopholes in the sanctions, particularly against smaller Russian banks that are fronting for the bigger banks, financial transfers to Russia that are still getting through, and shipment of oil from Russia. Let's take away the insurance of those ships, and imports of Russian oil and gas, which are still not shut down yet.
Given the state of the European Union the way it is right now, do you see that happening at all?
Oil is certainly possible. There's no reason why imports of Russian oil could not be stopped. Gas, I know it's harder. I know people see a tough transition, especially going through this winter. But again, Ukrainians are paying for this with their lives. We have to have a sense of urgency, even if it means a bit higher prices. And I think Europe has the means to actually be able to take itself off of Russian gas sooner than the end of next year, which is the current idea.
And let's look ahead to possible future ties between the EU and Russia. In an interview on the 27th of June, Ambassador, you said the following: the decision the Europeans really need to be making is we can't live with this genocidal maniac next door to us anymore. I think you and I both agree that Putin doesn't look to be going away anytime soon. So what does that future look like?
Well, again, you can't deal with someone like Putin. He has ordered his forces into Ukraine as a direct war of aggression. He's lied to all of us about his intentions repeatedly. He has directed his forces to commit war crimes, including use of rape as a weapon of war, including the killing of civilians, including the targeting of maternity hospitals and civilian facilities. So this is not something where anyone in Europe can work with this Putin, this regime. So the regime is going to have to go. Now, that being said, I don't agree that we won't be seeing the end of Putin anytime soon. There are many indications that he is in poor health. That may even be one of the reasons why he is driving so hard to steal these territories from Ukraine now. He wants it to be part of his personal legacy. So I think that pressures are building as a result of the war effort and not going well for Russia, as a result of sanctions, as a result of internal pressures in Russia, that something may snap, and we should just not be afraid of that. We should keep pressing, putting the pressure on Russia.
Ambassador Volker, what would you like to see happening now in Europe so that peace returns after this war?
Well, I'd like to see Russia withdraw its forces from Ukraine. That's the way we'll have peace again. If Russia is able to continue to attack its neighbors, to steal their territory, to commit war crimes, and get away with it, there will never be security in Europe. There won't actually be peace. And remember that Russia occupies parts of Moldova and Georgia as well. So what we're seeing in Ukraine is brutal, but is a continuation of a many years pattern. And that means that pattern will continue in the future unless Russia is forced to pull out now.
Ambassador Kurt Volker, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.